Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to talk. A little bit about my positionality. I'm a queer person and a traditional storyteller based in Edinburgh. I haven't timed this, so I have the errant thrill of the gambler, and hopefully we'll come to time. Before we begin, this slideshow will discuss Indigenous knowledges from Native American and First Nations people. I'm not a member of either of those groups. Chances are, dear audience, neither are you. So before we begin, I want to express that I'm approaching this from a position of respect, and I fully expect to get some things wrong. I'm engaging with the principles laid out in the Assembly of First Nations Ethics Guide on Research and Aboriginal Traditional Knowledges and the First Nations Information Governance Centre. Research with these knowledge holders must be done in equitable partnership, and ultimately to understand these issues, we must platform the knowledge holders themselves. All that said, why am I talking to you about salmon? You might be thinking, Mark, salmon is like what is in the middle of my sushi. It's not a big part of my life. However, I would make the case, and so have others in the literature, that salmon are a critically important keystone species, one of the most important species in human history. Humans have historically settled on salmon runs. In fact, name any major city. Glasgow's one, Toronto's another, settled because of the abundance of salmon in the river. And that trophic flow of fresh fish up the river made early human life in these places possible. They are also, by heads of stock, the most farmed animal in the world today. Additionally, they are the most valuable farm product by mass. So like a gram of salmon is extremely valuable. So culturally and economically, an important species. Oh, there we go. Pictured here is the Koshuan Samoa in British Columbia. Obviously a photograph, so a recent sighting of. Here we see native people doing a very ancient form of spearfishing. These weirs don't stop the salmon, they slow them down and gives the people an opportunity to catch the salmon. Toronto, the city of, is named after the Toronto weirs, which are the earliest structures in North America. Salmon are a primary food source and very well respected, and these people often refer to themselves as a salmon people. Salmon's also important on this side of the Atlantic. Here we see Emmeline Rees, a prolific salmon poacher, a modern example of an ancient phenomenon. In this country, if you were found eating salmon, and your landlord could come into your house and lift the lid of your pot and check, because he owns your house, he owns the pot. If you were found eating salmon, they would deport you to Australia. And when people got to Australia, they saw all these beautiful rivers and thought, wow, we're the landlords now, let's seed salmon in these rivers, and undertook a decades-long mission to take salmon and get them to spawn in Australian Tasmanian rivers. Ultimately unsuccessful. But this shows how salmon are both a symbol of nationhood and a symbol of class and a nation in themselves. And these structures of mythology, economies, nationhood, and class structures, all of which has salmon as an active creator or co-creator within them. Coming back down from the national to the individual, salmon also are re-emerging as a... I'm just laughing at the comments in the chat, very good. You would not believe how many pictures of poached salmon I found while trying to find that picture of a salmon poacher. Salmon are re-emerging as a queer symbol and a rallying call for various kinds of queer activism. It's very important that we get the nuances here correct, because I'm going to talk about queerness from multiple cultures. So to do that, I'm going to talk briefly about being two-spirited. So two-spirit is a term which is relatively recent, only coined in 1990, following a series of 5 conferences and ratified at the 3rd Annual Intertribal Native American First Nations Gay and Lesbian American Conference. So it's very intentionally been designed as a catch-all phrase to make communication around the diaspora of sex and gender identities among First Nations people easier. During European contact, there was around 500 distinct Native American cultures, and around 150 of them had some kind of two-spirit identity. This screenshot is from an excellent YouTube video linked in the slide. Geo Neptune says that the term two-spirit was an attempt at self-determination across linguistic barriers because the English language imposed upon Indigenous people lacks the gender nuance required. In fact, it is quite prerogative. Europeans called gender nonconformist natives berdache, a prerogative term which indicates like prostitution among men. But berdache smears out all of the nuance. For instance, in Nadli, which is in the slide. There is a gender cosmology which includes 4 different gender expressions, each with their own name. Among the Crow people, some boys, some AMABs at the age of 10 or 12 would wear female clothing and take on female work. Among the Blackfoot, women who took on the aggressive roles of men, being warriors and such, were referred to as manly-hearted women. These would usually begin to take on these roles as teenagers, and they would join war parties, wear male dress, marry other women, and often obtain leadership positions as warriors or spiritual leaders. The Cree are documented as having 6 gender terms. Men who act like men and dress like men who act like men and dress like women, and men who act and dress like women and are accepted as women and do women's work. Vice versa, for women who act and dress like women who act like women but dress like men, and women who act and dress like men and are accepted as men. Yes, many stories about people poaching salmon on the in the chat. In some groups, two-spirit people are what we would usually identify as habituating one gender category, but would attend to both feminine and masculine tribal matters. Worth noting that some gender roles are interoperable, and doing masculine tasks as a woman or vice versa will not necessarily make you two-spirit. Two-spirited people are generally, but not always understood, as being a member of a third gender category, rather than being what we would understand from our perspective in the West as being trans people. There are also two-spirit people who would occupy roles separate from the roles described to men and women, such as spiritual leaders or matchmakers. Ceremonial roles were common. Critically, each nation's understanding of gender and sexual diversity is different and grounded in specific spiritual beliefs. Not all Native American cultures have historically had roles for gender variant people, and among those that do, no one indigenous culture's gender for sexuality categorically applies to all gender natives. So two-spirit is a term which aims to capture the full gender diversity of roles in the Native American diaspora. It's worth noting the risk is that it homogenizes all this difference, and it has been criticized for being too broad. It might be tempting to include it with other LGBT initials, and you do sometimes see it stylized as TS LGBT or LGBT2S, depending on how you're trying to prioritize it. But because it's tied to ethnicity in the ways that other ones aren't, some Native people dispute how appropriate its inclusion in that initialism is, because you can't be two-spirit if you're not from these ethnic groups. Here we see Oktish. I hope I'm pronounced that approximately appropriately. A Crow two-spirit person with long dark hair on the left, pictured with a AFAB woman. She was born male, but lives, dresses, and is accepted amongst the women. She's also a folk hero. When federal agent Briscoe came into Crow land and tried to force the two-spirit people there to get masculine haircuts, dressed like European males, etc., the tribal leaders were so incensed they drove Briscoe back off the land with violence. So these identities are precious and fiercely protected. But because of the colonialization of the soul and a crude shame around sex and gender, there's been a process of erasure. This is Madeline Terbasket, a two-spirit storyteller and drag artist. They are Silex, Ho-Chuk, and Anishinaabe. This is an online storytelling show they've done. It's linked in the slide. It's very good. In it, they say, our stories have to have queer characters and storylines. Sorry, I'll say again. Our stories used to have queer characters and storylines in them. Because of everything that's happened with colonialization, people correcting my pronunciation in the chat, thank you. I don't get out much. My encounters with almost all of this is through written literature. So my pronunciation will not be correct. Our stories used to have queer characters and storylines in them, but because of everything that's happened with colonialization and the impacts of that, they have refined them out of our stories out of shame. So I wanted to put queer characters back in the forefront of our stories. Nota bene, the same thing seems to have happened in British stories. An example could be the story of the Red Etin, where there's 2 men closer than brothers. One goes off on an adventure and says, "Here's my knife. If it rusts, I'm in trouble." He goes off and gets captured by the giant, the Red Etin. His friend's knife rusts, and he realizes that his friend is in danger. Goes off, faces great tribulation to rescue him from the giant's castle. While there, he also rescues 2 women, and all 4 of them get married to the respective women. It seems, like literally possible at least, that this was at one point a queer love story. And there's loads of examples that scholars have identified of stories that have been straightened out in a way that is, superfluous to the narrative that's trying to happen there. But as queer storytelling reemerges, so does the symbology of the salmon. This is from an art exhibit from 2009 in Montreal called Two-Spirit Man, Two-Spirit Woman, Call Home the Salmon with Help. Pictured on the right are skirts, which Two-Spirit people would wear during the first salmon ceremony. These highlight the feminine to illustrate how heteromasculinity has taken over the salmon ceremonies. Artist Dana Danger suggested in the past these would have been worn by Two-Spirit people who would have been as spiritual leaders conducting the ceremonies. They also filmed and displayed the ceremony against the wishes of the village elders. So there's some conflict there around ownership of these rituals, and some behavior that the elders wouldn't sanction around re-queering the rituals as well, which is interesting. I won't be showing any of that forbidden material. In this exhibit, the salmon is chosen as a symbol of queer identity and resistance, both against gender oppression and against oil pipelines, which are a major pollution risk to Canadian water systems, and a risk to the sovereignty and identity of the First Nation people. And you see that on the left there, some of the prints that feature salmon that are around that topic. I'm going to try and illustrate why salmon in particular have become a focus point for this symbology. This is one of the artists, Jeffrey McNeil Seymour. And this is the skirt that we just saw with the salmon decorations. Jeffrey says, on the morning of the ceremony, my aunt shows up at 6 o'clock in the morning. She'd been up all night adding the salmon detail, and she wrapped me in the skirt. We are a wild salmon people, and that's basically what our culture is, and our sacred responsibility is to protect the salmon. We are salmon people has two meanings here, both that we are a people who are economically dependent on the salmon, but also that we are people with the salmon, wealth, and the multifarious nation that the salmon represents within the soul, within the self. Water is medicine and medicine is water. We are salmon people, says Jeffrey McNeil Seymour, who is there pictured. Salmon is a fish of transformation, called the rainbow fish very often. It has multiple life stages, each with its own distinct needs, and each is very different from the other. They're born as tiny eggs. They hatch into alevin, who carry the eggs with them in fresh water. Then they become sociable, freshwater fry, who are mostly filter fish and eat like acorns and little grubs and stuff. Then they have a great puberty, where they are called down to the sea, get accustomed to salt water, and become these solitary predators. Who are the ocean-going salmon. Then they return to the river as ocean-going fish to lay their eggs. So salmon leave as these tiny little sociable, like cute fish, and come back as these great warriors. The salmon is the transformation fish. And as such, a powerful transformative symbol. We find this in stories related to salmon. Lake Quiltac, pronunciation apologies, stories around human souls being reborn as salmon, where the brave souls given the mask of the larger, stronger salmon, and weaker human souls given the masks of a smaller pink salmon. They have combinations there of human qualities of bravery and value, with the salmon morphologies and internal variation. Salmon can also transform into copper. The source of this copper is alluvial nuggets, which are eroded from the upper watershed and flood downriver. But this means that they are found after the river floods high in the river. So Simeon people refer to copper found up high in rivers as living copper, and say that the salmon goes upriver and transforms into it when it reaches the top of the river. Salmon swim up the river and copper comes back down. Copper are signs of status and value. They are a form of currency. They are often displayed at the entrance to the home as a sign of wealth and status. You see the mounting holes on the left there of a salmon that was displayed at the entrance to the home. In potlatch ceremonies, the copper can be broken and thrown into the river. This is a display of wealth, but also ceremonial returning to the water of life, just like how salmon bones are returned in the first salmon ceremony. In this way, salmon are tied to rebirth, ancestors, wealth, fortune, and nourishment. Cullen suggests that the symbolic tethering of the natural wealth of the tropically abundant salmon and the material wealth of the copper is well evidenced. Both are wealth that literally flow down the river. Again, here we see the treasured nature of salmon. The connotations with wealth and fortune, and the ability to delineate spaces they're given as they hung at the entrance of the house, which makes sense that these would be a symbol of choice for a re-queering of culture. Pictured here is the salmon of knowledge, which is a Celtic myth. The salmon swims out from the Albion River to the other world, Tunanog, eats hazelnuts from the tree of wisdom, carries his wisdom back to the human world, where Finn McCool eats the salmon and uses that wisdom to be wise and judicious. Salmon are the world walkers, the wisdom carriers, and the great changers. What's interesting about these mythic stories is they don't fit neatly into categories that we often use to discuss stories in the social geographies. They're neither a large, broad story, like Marxism, or a small, personal, biographical fact. Despite being local level stories about identifiable people whose location and identity can be named and known, they lack the directness and verisimilitude of a first-person account or a fieldwork observation because they've been smeared out into a canon of myth. They also lack a certain truth, especially when containing fictional creatures who do not truly exist, but they present a broader kind of knowledge through theory-laden mythological elements, which are more like the economic or social theories found in larger stories. Kwakakewaka, I'm pretty confident I said that one correctly, have a creation story where the great inventor returns salmon bones to the water and they leap back to life. In these stories, salmon have the same souls as humans and return to the world wearing the human mask with the express intention of giving their flesh as a gift. As a quote from this text, she just sent the younger sisters of the great inventor's wife to the beach to play in the water. Then the children became salmon. They became sock-eye salmon. They were cut quickly, they were roasted. After they had been eaten, the bones were gathered and were thrown into the water. Immediately the salmon jumped and came back to life. That was dictated to Franz Boas, or Hunt, in the materials that they gathered. The returning of salmon bones is also found in the story of Woodpecker's wife, where she disguises herself to return salmon bones to the river in order to restart the migration of salmon to their home. This manifests in modern day rituals such as the first salmon ceremony, where the first salmon of the year is eaten slowly and ceremoniously and its bones returned as a show of respect to make sure the salmon return in the next year. It has been proposed by scholars that the ritual meal of the first salmon, the preparation of which can take days, performs an ecosystem service of allowing the salmon enough time to swim upstream and to spawn so they're not accidentally overhunting the broodstock who provide the eggs for next year's crop. Because creation myths and ceremonial practice are both part of the same oral culture, this combination of story and practice can be understood to co-develop in semiosis with the morphology of the salmon. Meaning that the location of the myth generation in this example is smeared out between observer and subject. These bones are an artifact of salmon's skeletal structure and of humans' digestive capabilities. There's a lot there, and I wish we had more time to digest that. But before we move too far along, it's worth dwelling on cosmological myths, which Harris uses to refer to the role of stories to open space for contemplation and reflection in cosmologies that precede and exceed Western knowledge systems. Continuing, Harris says, in many ways, climate change challenges the limits of human cognition, its spatial and temporal scales needed to abstract to comprehend in their entirety. Focusing on here on the value of myths to guide us and to complexify our thinking. Storytelling is not only a way to pass on teachings and cultures, but it's also significant in the healing of mental imbalances in the context of holistic understandings, which includes all aspects of a person and their interconnectedness with everyone and everything around them. Salmon have also entered into the zeitgeist. I found this Reddit post, Salmon are the bisexuals of water, which has since been deleted. Gay salmon has 175,000 views on TikTok. Singer Tom Goss refers to himself as a salmon, saying that that's what bears catch. So there is room in the wider imagination for queering of salmon as well. So in conclusion, why are queer people choosing salmon as their spirit animal? Salmon are wise, transformative, multifarious creatures. Coined to the rainbow fish, salmon are a powerful ancient symbol of transformation, struggle, wisdom, wealth, and change. By aligning themselves with the salmon, queer people are reclaiming an ancient power and manifesting these qualities in their own wise, rainbow, otherly, world-walking selves. There is no reference slide. Eventually this paper will be edited together and made available on my website, but if you would like the references sooner or would like to discuss this more, please feel free to contact me at the email that's on the slide on the screen right now. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mark. Someone has found the clapping react. I can see those popping up at the bottom of the screen, which is very exciting. I am, as always, not going to immediately jump in for questions. leave a couple of seconds. Questions, raising your hand is good, typing in the chat is good. Oh, there is a question from Joe. Thank you. Just unmute yourself and ask.
Thanks, Mark. And thanks, Mark. I really enjoyed that. That's a lot of information about something I knew not a lot about. So that's really sort of interesting. Unfortunately, my feed crackled out slightly at one point. So I was wondering, could you go back to how salmon are copper? That link wasn't quite clear. Like physically, do they transform into copper? The same, my feed crackled out.
Sure. Salmon is understood to transform into copper as one of its many transformations. These copper nuggets are, on a geological level, are washed down by floods from the upper river, and on a mythical level, the salmon swim upstream, where they transform into those copper nuggets. So copper is viewed as being one of the life cycles of the salmon, and spring salmon transform into copper and are symbolically connected. And when people display their wealth using copper, they are engaging with the wider spirit of wealth, which is embodied in salmon, which is the material wealth and the health of the food economy. It can't be overstated the extent to which salmon were critically important for the ongoing survival of people. Through smoking and then later through canning. It is a huge trophic shift. And once a year, the rivers run fat with salmon who've come upstream, laid their eggs, can't handle the fresh water and die. And that is a huge boon to everybody, especially people who aren't living in a globalized food system where food is readily available. Which we forget was a very recent time, even for people living in the UK. Any more questions about copper?
No, thank you. That covered it. Thank you.
No more questions about copper, which is currently tragic. While people come up with more questions, I was wondering about the sort of Scottish / sort of British / Northern European side of salmon storytelling, and I was wondering if you'd like to sort of say more about that.
Yeah, so this is very interesting, and it's also it's not been subject to much critical attention. The extent to which there is a white British indigeneity, and how is that similar and how is it different to other forms of indigenous studies? Because there are people and cultures who have lived on this island who are distinct from the dominant culture. There are people here who have folkways that have been oppressed or extinguished. But they also share in the material wealth and the race of the culture who have oppressed others elsewhere. So it's interesting to think about the ways in which Scottish English cultures are similar to what I've been talking about, but it's also worth noting the material differences there. It's very interesting to me that the salmon as mythic knowledge symbol is shared across both places. The salmon of knowledge is called the cornerstone of Celtic myth. And it's a little bit like Eve and the apple. The salmon goes and it eats of this otherworldly food, and as such it gains this great wisdom. It's also a little bit like Prometheus, because it brings that wisdom and gives it to everybody. And it is how like certain Celtic cultures are shaped. They give that to the salmon of wisdom in thanks. There are plenty of stories here about salmon. Other than that, the myth of Saint Kentigern, the king suspects his wife is cheating on him, and he sets a trap. So he gets her ring and he throws it into the ocean, and he says, "I know you're cheating on me, and I know you've given my ring to the man you're cheating on me with. So bring him here." And obviously she can't do right here because she doesn't have the ring and she's been faithful. So she goes to Saint Kentigern, sometimes Saint Mungo, and says, what do I do? Saint Mungo goes out to sea, catches a fish, brings it in, cooks it for the king, lays it on the table. The king cuts into it, digs in his fork, and out comes the ring on the tine of his fork. So the salmon there is wise. It's the hero. It's salvific. It is bringing that that required information from without to